While I tell you the story of my life, I will work on my paintings so that you can see what I do as well as hear what I have been doing since I was 10 years old, 70 years ago. I was born in New York City on April 26, 1916. Born on September 21st, 1888, my mother Charlotte was a concert pianist and very beautiful. Ever since I was very, very young, probably 4 years at the most, I can still see my mother sitting at the piano and playing. The piano was a Steinway concert grand that my father purchased at the beginning of the century. My mother's father was an immigrant from Germany. Her mother was an immigrant from Norway. My father, Ferdinand Pinney Earle II, born June 8, 1878, was an extraordinary artist, writer, poet, motion picture producer, director, and art director. But most of all, he was a painter, and as a young man, he had studied with such famous artists as James McNeill Whistler and William Adolphe Bouguereau. He was the oldest of 4 brothers, and the family was very rich. His father was General Ferdinand Pinney Earle, and they lived in the Jumel Mansion in New York, George Washington's headquarters during the Revolution. My mother was my father's 4th marriage. My brother Ferdy was a year and 9 months older than myself. In 1916, when I was born, my father worked for the motion picture industry in New Jersey. It was at that time that the whole movie industry was moving to Hollywood, California, because the weather was almost perfect for picture making. For that reason, in 1918, we moved from New York to Hollywood, where my father bought 2.5 acres with a large home just 4 blocks from Hollywood Boulevard, way out in the country. Across the street, several years later, the Hollywood Bowl came into existence. When I was 8 years old in 1924, my brother Ferdy died of polio. We called it infantile paralysis then. The day after his burial, I came down with the same sickness, but instead of killing me, it simply left me with the right side of my face paralyzed, and that, more than anything in the world, influenced my behavior and career for the rest of my life. To this day, I try not to smile or laugh, but of course when I was young, it mattered much more than now. So I compensated for my crooked smile by spending all my time working, a habit which has stayed with me all my life. I was 10 years old when my mother divorced my father, and in January of 1927, my father got permission from my mother to take me to Palm Springs for the weekend. Instead of Palm Springs, we were on the train to Mexico City. On the train, he announced to me that from this day forward, I was to read at least 50 pages a day or paint a painting or both. For 4 years, I ended up doing both. Except for school, I was never allowed to play with other children. From morning until night, I read books and painted paintings and spent thousands of hours writing out long sentences in perfect penmanship as punishment for my father's strange imagination. When I had just turned 14, I gave my first one-man exhibition at a gallery in Asquin, France. It was that summer, possibly in July, that I ran away from my father. And with the help of my half-brother Harold, who lived in Paris, I finally arrived back in Hollywood on New Year's Day, 4 years after leaving. The year was 1931. The Great Depression had hit. Financially, we were wiped out. From 1931 to 1940, my mother and I struggled through 9 years of the Depression. We had a few ups and downs. In 1934, I quit high school 2 months before graduating. All I wanted to do was paint and sing and play the violin and guitar. That same year, I got a job at United Artists Studios as assistant sketch artist, earning $20 a week. Suddenly, my mother and I were almost millionaires. It lasted less than a year. And then Grace Tibbett, the wife of the great baritone Lawrence Tibbett, gave me $25 a month to live in Mexico for a year and just paint. Without the Tibbett family, my mother and myself could never have survived the Great Depression. All through the early years, I painted every day and sold my work for as little as 25 cents a painting, and finally as much as $15 a piece by 1937. It was my habit to ride my bike with my watercolors in a knapsack and travel 10, 20, 30, and even up to 100 miles in one day looking for subjects. That's when I got the idea of riding my bike in one direction instead of coming home every night. So with 110 pounds of baggage and $21 in my pocket, I left home on October 11th, 1937, and headed east with my grandmother's home in Monroe, New York, as my final destination. I traveled 3,268 miles in 42 days of pedaling, and I painted exactly 42 watercolors. Near the end of November, I landed at my grandmother's home. By then, she too was dead broke. Her husband died falling over his rifle out hunting. Clever investors wiped her out of all her savings. So I worked for her for nothing for over a month, until one day Grace Tibbett came to my rescue and took me to New York City and bought me 2 suits of clothes at Bloomingdale's. And I went out and found an art gallery that wanted to give me a show immediately. The result was a great success with fabulous write-ups from newspapers and magazines. At the same time, I fell in love with the most beautiful Norwegian girl from Brooklyn, and I spent all my money taking her out. It was in late spring of 1938 that I drove Grace Tibbett back to Los Angeles, and after painting 2 portraits and selling a few watercolors, I drove my mother back to New York in our beat-up Willie's Night, all because I was in love with Liev Stolt. After our arrival in New York, we were so poor, I never took Liev out again, and my mother and I were poorer this time than we had ever been before. In 1939, I started designing Christmas cards and printing them by hand from hunks of linoleum that I picked up for nothing. I worked with my mother till midnight, 7 days a week. In 1940, an old friend of the family, Bob Monroe, suggested that we start a Christmas card company together. Our company was called Monroe and Earl. It lasted 1 year, and after that, we each went our own way. It was that same year that from my third New York exhibition at the Charles Morgan Galleries, the Metropolitan Museum of Art purchased one of my paintings for their permanent collection. In 1941, with the same printing press, I started a new company called Earl and Ball, with my old friend Everett Ball from California. That lasted until I was drafted in the Navy in October of 1943. My mother ran the company till the end of the year. For 2 years and 3 months as a hospital corpsman and pharmacist mate in the Navy, I painted 210 oil portraits of the sailors, as well as enough watercolors for an exhibit in Los Angeles, and Christmas card designs for a new company called Edna Marco, not to mention a mural of Navy life painted in Jacksonville, Florida. On October 13th, 1945, I married a wave named Alice from Worcester, Massachusetts. On August 6, 1946, Kristen, my daughter, was born. At the end of 1947, I signed a contract with the American Artist Group to design 25 Christmas card designs a year for a special book of my own. Although it would be a year or more before we received any money, I knew it was the beginning of the end of poverty.